I'm Tony Farrar. I'd like to solve world hunger. I'd like to end the AIDS epidemic too. I'd like to reverse climate change caused by carbon emissions. I'd like to help people feel less lonely. I'd like to connect my students to their dream jobs. But normally when folks make a big list of dreams like this, the next thing they say is, but. But that problem is just too big for me to solve. But I'm just one person. But everything seems stacked against me. I'm not here to say but today. Have you ever considered doing something that was so big, so overwhelming? Have you ever given up before you even started because it just looked too big to get done? Maybe it was a class project or a homework assignment or cleaning your room or repairing a damaged relationship. Big problems can look intimidating. The problem with trying to feed 7 billion people is that you're trying to feed 7 billion people. It's easy to think that the people who made any real impact got lucky. We love to cite the overnight success or people who seem like they were just in the right place at the right time. We love the got lucky narrative because it's a guilt-free out for the rest of us. I'm not the type to win the lottery. That's for someone else. I can't start Apple Computer in my garage. I'm not Woz. I'm not Steve Jobs. That's for someone else. The narrative that we miss? The story of the careful designer who applied empathy and insight and created something so elegant that we don't even notice it. When's the last time that you thought about a light switch? My mother-in-law has sideways light switches. That's kind of a dangerous thing if you're trying to turn on the fan, but not the light in the bedroom that your toddler's sleeping in. How do I know which one's on or off? When's the last time you thought about your windshield wipers? Maybe not too frequently if you live in the desert like I do. But windshield wipers and light switches were both cutting-edge technologies, invented and designed in a world that didn't have things like that. In 1902, a person by the name of Mary Anderson was riding along in a tram car, watching the driver freeze as they drove through the cold rain with both panes of the windshield open. That's how they solved this problem before windshield wipers. Drive without a windshield. Welcome to EGG 101. This is a class about the design process and how engineers use this simple and elegant system to give themselves great ideas. The first stage is empathize. Mary Anderson empathized with the driver and maybe the folks in the first few rows of the car because the current solution to driving in the cold rain caused someone pain. We don't solve problems in a vacuum. We make things for people who are going to use them. What's it like to have this problem that this person has? What's it like to be a grandparent who isn't tech savvy but lives far away from their grandkids? What's it like to sit in traffic during rush hour just trying to get home to a loved one? What's it like to escape reality on the latest ride at Disney World? Galaxy's Edge is far more than a collection of wood and steel and stucco. It's an invitation to a place that I've dreamed of visiting my entire life, with my dad, who's dreamed of visiting it his entire life too. Once we've empathized, the next step is define. We want to define a clear goal, because without one, how do we know where we're going? The cockpit of the Ford Flex is confusing. There's a touch screen. It's got nested menus. There's 47 buttons around the steering wheel. What's the goal here? Think about the Apple Pippin. You ever heard of that thing? This was a console, and it had games and web browsing and education all tied together, and it fell flat. Nobody wanted it. Why? Well, because it tried to do too much. They didn't solve a clear problem. They tried to solve a whole host of things, and it just didn't work. Once we have a clear goal, it's time to start trying to have ideas. This is where we're brainstorming. But we have to be careful. We don't want to get stuck on a single idea, right? You have to wonder, when they sat around inventing the first USB connector, did they think through how this thing would be used? There's an old joke now, old now I guess anyhow, where at the inventor of the USB connector's funeral, they're going to lower the casket into the ground, raise it out, turn it around, lower it again, raise it out, turn around, lower it again. What happened here? Well, they got stuck on their first idea without really thinking it through. And so one of the things we're going to talk a lot about is generating a huge collection of ideas and then starting to talk through which one's going to work best. From there, we start moving into prototyping. And the attitude that we want you to start having is that everything is a draft. Everything is a prototype that could be improved or tinkered or tested until we find out what it really does. Think about the windows on the lunar lander. This was a really interesting story. They needed to cut weight to make it lighter, and one of the heaviest parts on this vehicle was the window panes. And so, after lots of thinking, the designers thought, well, we could shrink the windows, and while we're at it, by the way, we could completely get rid of the seats. The original design for the lander had seats with seat belts and all this stuff. So they go to the project manager and they say, hey, here's our idea. We're going to get rid of the seats and put these little teeny windows in. To which, of course, the manager says, well, how on earth are they going to be stable? How on earth are they going to see? And the answer is, well, they're not on Earth. They're on the moon. Still couldn't see it. Still couldn't picture it. Still couldn't imagine it. And so the designers ended up spending the night building a mock-up out of cardboard. It said, step in and look for yourself. The designers stepped in. They invited the manager to go with them. And with these two little handles and your face pressed against that window, you could see everything you needed to see to land the lander. And lastly, we need to test. Nothing matters other than how this works for the end user. When you put it in their hands, what happens? One of my favorite failures from the 90s was the Nintendo Virtual Boy, which is one of the first commercially available virtual reality machines that people played with. And if you ever played with one, this thing had red light inside of it, and it became famous for causing headaches and dizziness and all kinds of stuff because they hadn't tested it well enough to find out what would happen when a real user used it instead of just, playing a demo. Listen, we're here to change the world. And here's how we're going to do it, through design. I opened up talking about some really big problems, and here's how design can help. Think about world hunger for a minute. Did you know that traffic affects world hunger? There are places on Earth where there are ships full of food rotting in harbors because it cannot be put onto vehicles and driven to the people who need the food fast enough. The food spoils. If we could figure out a way to optimize traffic in developing nations, we could start to solve world hunger. Think about AIDS again. One of the biggest issues is people reusing syringes. So we could design auto-disabling syringes. Once you use it once, if you try to refill it with another liquid, it breaks and you cannot use this to inject anything again. But now we end up with a new problem, discarded sharps. In many developing nations, the needles, once they're used, are tossed out the back of the hospital window into a pile where animals and things can, of course, go rummage around and get contaminated. Imagine for a moment if people listened to their doctors and all 7 billion people on Earth went out and got a flu shot this year, or a COVID vaccine. 7 billion needles. How do you get rid of 7 billion needles? So, what's an engineer do? Engineers make things better by making better things. That's your challenge and that's your goal, and it's going to be a great semester.